The dusty main street of Willowbrook stretched empty under the blazing Montana sun, except for one figure walking slowly toward the center of town. Clara Morrison's boots clicked against the weathered wooden planks as she approached the general store where a crowd had gathered. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her simple traveling dress couldn't hide the confident way she carried herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody recognized her at first. Why would they? The last time anyone in Willowbrook had seen Clara Morrison, she was 13 years old, crying as the stagecoach pulled away from the only home she'd ever known. Now at 27, she was something else entirely. Something that would shake this small frontier town to its very foundations. As she stepped onto the porch of Henderson's General Store, conversations stopped, eyes turned, and slowly, one by one, the older residents began to remember a girl who had been cast out in shame all those years ago. A girl who, according to the whispers that had followed her departure, would never amount to anything. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. 14 years earlier, Willowbrook had been a different place. Smaller, more isolated, where everyone knew everyone else's business and moral judgment came swift and harsh. The town sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, with the Rocky Mountains visible in the distance. It was 1878, and the frontier was still wild, still unforgiving, especially to those who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of respectability. Clara Morrison had been born into this world as the daughter of Thomas Morrison, the town's blacksmith, and his wife Margaret. The Morrison family lived in a modest house behind the smithy, where the sound of hammer on anvil rang out from dawn until dusk. Thomas was a respected man in the community, known for his skill with metal and his strong moral character. Margaret was active in the church, organizing charity drives and helping with the Sunday school. Clara had always been different from other girls her age. While her peers were content to help their mothers with cooking and sewing, Clara was fascinated by her father's work. She would sneak into the smithy whenever she could, watching him shape horseshoes and repair wagon wheels. By the time she was 10, she could identify different types of metal just by looking at them. By 11, she was helping her father with simple tasks, pumping the bellows and organizing his tools. The other families in town didn't quite know what to make of Clara Morrison. She was bright, perhaps too bright for her own good. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable and had opinions about things that young ladies weren't supposed to think about. When the traveling preacher came through town and spoke about women's proper place in society, Clara had raised her hand and asked why God would give women brains if they weren't supposed to use them. The resulting silence had been deafening, but Clara's differences might have been overlooked, might have been written off as childhood curiosity that would fade with time. If not for what happened in the spring of 1878. It started with Joshua Blackwood, the son of the town's wealthiest family. The Blackwoods owned the largest ranch in the county, with thousands of acres of prime grazing land and a herd of cattle that seemed to grow every year. Joshua was 18, handsome in the way that comes with confidence and privilege, and he had a reputation for getting what he wanted. Clara had noticed him watching her during church services, his eyes following her as she sat with her family in their usual pew. At first, she had been flattered. Joshua Blackwood was everything the other girls in town whispered about. Tall, with sandy hair and blue eyes that seemed to promise adventure. When he started finding excuses to visit the smithy, asking her father to repair things that didn't seem particularly broken, Clara began to understand that she was the real reason for his visits. The attention was intoxicating. Joshua would linger after conducting his business with her father, making conversation about the weather or the upcoming harvest festival. He complimented her intelligence, something that no one else in town seemed to value. He told her she was different from other girls. special in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. When Joshua suggested they meet in secret, Clara's 13-year-old heart had leaped with excitement. He said he wanted to talk to her away from the prying eyes of the townspeople, to really get to know her without the constraints of social expectations. They began meeting in an abandoned cabin about a mile outside of town, a place where gold prospectors had once lived before moving on to more promising claims. What happened in that cabin would change Clara's life forever. Joshua was older, experienced, persuasive. He spoke of love and promises, of a future together that seemed impossibly bright to a girl who had never felt truly understood before. He said he was going to ask her father for permission to court her properly, as soon as she was a little older. He made her feel mature beyond her years, special, chosen. The physical relationship that developed between them was Clara's first experience with intimacy of any kind. She trusted Joshua completely, believed every word he said about their future together. When he told her that what they were doing was natural and right because they loved each other, she believed him. When he said they would be married soon, and that this was just a preview of their life together, she accepted it without question. For 3 months, they met in secret. Clara told her parents she was visiting friends or helping at the church. The lies came easily, justified by the promise of a future that Joshua painted for her. She dreamed of being Mrs. Joshua Blackwood, of living in the big house on the hill, of finally being accepted and admired in the community. But Joshua Blackwood had never intended to marry Clara Morrison, the blacksmith's daughter. He had plans that involved the daughter of a cattle baron in the next county, a girl whose dowry would expand the Blackwood holdings significantly. Clara was a diversion, a way to pass time before his real life began. When Clara realized she was pregnant, she was terrified but also strangely excited. Surely this would accelerate Joshua's plans to marry her. Surely this would make their relationship official and permanent. She imagined telling her parents about the engagement, about how she was going to be Mrs. Blackwood after all. She met Joshua at their usual place, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She had practiced the words she would use, had imagined his joy at the news. Instead, she found a stranger. Joshua's face went white when she told him about the pregnancy. The warm, loving expression she had grown accustomed to disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't embrace her or express joy. Instead, he stepped back as if she had struck him. "That's impossible," he said, his voice flat and distant. "You must be mistaken." When Clara insisted that she was certain, Joshua's mask slipped completely. He accused her of trying to trap him, of attempting to force him into a marriage he had never agreed to. He reminded her that he was a Blackwood, that his family had a reputation to maintain. He suggested that the baby might not even be his, that perhaps she had been meeting with other men in secret. The accusations hit Clara like physical blows. She watched in horror as the boy she thought she loved revealed himself to be someone else entirely. Someone cruel and selfish and completely without honor. When she pressed him about his promises, about the future they had planned together, Joshua laughed bitterly. He told her that she had been naive to believe such things, that men said all sorts of things to get what they wanted from girls, and that she should have known better than to take him seriously. Clara left that cabin a different person than the one who had entered it. The innocence that had sustained her through 13 years of life was gone, replaced by a hard understanding of how the world really worked. She walked home slowly, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. For a week, she said nothing to anyone. She went through the motions of her daily routine, helping her mother with household tasks, listening to her father's stories about his work, attending church services where she sat next to the very people who would soon condemn her. She kept hoping that Joshua would change his mind, that he would realize he had made a mistake and come to make things right. But Joshua Blackwood had already moved on. Within days of their confrontation, word spread through town that he was courting Rebecca Chambers, the daughter of the wealthy cattle rancher from the neighboring county. The engagement was announced in the territorial newspaper, complete with details about the elaborate wedding that was being planned. Clara realized that she was entirely alone, that the pregnancy couldn't be hidden forever. By the time Clara was 4 months along, her condition was becoming obvious despite her efforts to conceal it. Margaret Morrison was the first to notice the changes in her daughter's body and behavior. The confrontation, when it came, was devastating. Margaret had been folding laundry when she looked up and really saw her daughter for the first time in weeks. Clara was standing by the window, her hand unconsciously resting on her slightly rounded stomach, and the truth hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. "Clara," her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me I'm wrong." But Clara couldn't tell her that. Instead, she broke down completely, sobbing as she confessed everything. The secret meetings, the promises Joshua had made, the way he had abandoned her when she needed him most. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her face cycling through shock, disappointment, and finally, a kind of resigned grief. When Thomas Morrison learned the truth, his reaction was explosive. The gentle man who had never raised his voice to his daughter was suddenly a stranger, his face red with rage and shame. He demanded to know who the father was, and when Clara finally whispered Joshua's name, Thomas's anger reached a fever pitch. Thomas marched to the Blackwood Ranch that very afternoon, his purpose clear to anyone who saw him. He found Joshua in Corpus clear anyone who saw him. The main barn, overseeing the care of some prize horses. Without preamble, Thomas grabbed the younger man by the shirt and shoved him against the wall. "You're going to marry my daughter," Thomas growled, his blacksmith's hand strong enough to lift Joshua off his feet. "You're going to do right by her, or I'll make you wish you'd never been born." But Joshua Blackwood was not intimidated. He had his father's workers within shouting distance, and he knew that Thomas Morrison had no real power in this situation. He straightened his clothes and looked Thomas in the eye with cold contempt. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Joshua said calmly. "If your daughter is claiming that I'm responsible for her condition, she's lying. I've never touched her inappropriately, and I have witnesses who can attest to my character." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The denial was so complete, so confident, that for a moment Thomas wavered. But he knew. His daughter knew that Clara was not the type of girl to lie about something so serious. He pressed forward, demanding that Joshua acknowledge his responsibility. Joshua's response was swift and brutal. He called Clara a seductress, a girl who had thrown herself at him despite his attempts to maintain proper boundaries. He suggested that she had been intimate with multiple men and was now trying to pin the responsibility on him because of his family's wealth and status. The lies came so easily, so convincingly, that Thomas realized he was facing an opponent who was utterly without conscience. Joshua Blackwood would destroy Clara's reputation completely rather than accept responsibility for his actions. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Willowbrook. In a town where gossip was the primary form of entertainment, the story of the Morrison girl's pregnancy and the Blackwood boy's denial became the subject of every conversation. People chose sides based on their loyalties and prejudices, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Blackwoods were the most powerful family in the county. They owned thousands of acres of land, employed dozens of workers, and had connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Thomas Morrison was a skilled blacksmith, but he was just one man with a small business and no political influence. More importantly, the social dynamics of frontier life were stacked against Clara from the beginning. A pregnant 13-year-old girl had committed the ultimate transgression, regardless of the circumstances. She had violated the strict moral code that held frontier communities together, and society demanded punishment. Joshua Blackwood, meanwhile, was a young man from a good family who was already engaged to a respectable girl. His denials were accepted at face value by most of the townspeople, who preferred to believe that Clara had been promiscuous rather than face the uncomfortable truth about their community's golden boy. The harassment began almost immediately. Women who had previously greeted Clara with smiles now crossed the street to avoid her. Children were forbidden from playing with her or speaking to her. The Morrison family's business began to suffer as customers found excuses to take their work elsewhere. At church, the Morrison family found themselves increasingly isolated. Reverend Patterson, who had once praised Clara's intelligence and curiosity, now delivered sermons about the wages of sin and the importance of moral purity. The message was clear. Clara Morrison was a cautionary tale, a warning to other young women about the consequences of improper behavior. The final blow came when the town council met to discuss the Morrison situation. The meeting was held in the back room of the general store, with all the prominent citizens in attendance. The Blackwood family was represented by Joshua's father, Richard, who spoke eloquently about the need to protect the community's moral standards. The council's decision was swift and unanimous. Clara Morrison was a corrupting influence on the town's youth, a living reminder of sin and degradation. She needed to be removed from the community before she could do more damage. Thomas Morrison was given an ultimatum: send his daughter away or face the complete destruction of his business and social standing. The choice was presented as being for the good of the community, but everyone understood what it really was: a demand for sacrifice to preserve the comfort and reputation of more powerful families. The night before Clara's departure, the Morrison family sat in their kitchen in stunned silence. Margaret had packed a small bag with her daughter's few belongings, while Thomas had arranged for Clara to be sent to a distant aunt in Oregon. The plan was for Clara to have her baby there, give it up for adoption, and then nobody was quite sure what would happen then. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, looking older than her 13 years. The events of the past months had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical. The trusting, curious girl who had once asked uncomfortable questions in church was gone, replaced by someone harder and more knowing. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her parents, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry for what I've brought on our family." Margaret Morrison crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her daughter, both of them crying. Thomas stood by the window, his shoulders shaking with suppressed rage and grief. They were losing their only child, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, Clara Morrison climbed aboard the stagecoach that would take her away from Willowbrook forever. She was 13 years old, pregnant, and alone in the world. The townspeople who had once known her as the bright, curious daughter of the blacksmith now watched her departure with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. As the stagecoach rolled down the dusty main street, Clara looked back at the only home she had ever known. She saw the church where she had asked her uncomfortable questions, the general store where she had bought penny candy, the smithy where her father had taught her to appreciate the beauty of shaped metal, and she saw Joshua Blackwood standing on the porch of the hotel, watching her leave with cold, satisfied eyes. Clara Morrison turned away from the window and faced forward, toward an uncertain future. She had no money, no education, no prospects. According to everyone in Willowbrook, she was ruined, worthless, destined for a life of shame and poverty. They had no idea what they had just unleashed upon the world. The stagecoach disappeared into the distance, carrying with it a girl who had learned hard lessons about power, justice, and the price of naivety. Willowbrook settled back into its comfortable routine, confident that it had dealt appropriately with a threat to its moral order. 14 years would pass before anyone in town would see Clara Morrison again. When she finally returned, she would Be a different person entirely, someone who had not only survived her exile, but had thrived in ways that would astonish and terrify the people who had cast her out. The girl who had left, Willowbrook in tears and shame, would return as a woman, with the power to shake the very foundations of the community that had rejected her. And she would use that power in ways that no one could have imagined. But that morning, as the dust settled on the empty Main Street, the people of Willowbrook believed they had seen the last of Clara Morrison. They were wrong, but they would not discover their mistake for many years to come. The story of what happened to the banished girl, and what she would become during her years of exile, was a tale that would eventually reshape everything the townspeople thought they knew about justice, power, and the consequences of their choices. Clara Morrison was gone. But her story was just beginning. The stagecoach that carried Clara Morrison away from Willowbrook was a cramped, dusty vehicle that had seen better days. The leather seats were cracked and faded, and the wooden frame creaked ominously with every bump in the rough mountain road. Clara sat in the corner, her small bag clutched tightly in her lap, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Her fellow passengers were a diverse group typical of frontier travel. There was a traveling salesman named Edgar Whitman, his sample cases stacked around his feet, who kept glancing at Clara with barely concealed curiosity. A middle-aged woman named Mrs. Helen Cartwright sat opposite her, dressed in widow's black, her lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. Two miners, brothers named Jake and Pete Sullivan, occupied the remaining seats, their clothes still bearing traces of the gold dust that had called them west. The journey to Oregon would take 2 weeks, with stops in various towns along the way. Clara had enough money for food and lodging, barely thanks to her father's careful savings. But she knew that when she reached her destination, she would be entirely dependent on the charity of an aunt she had never met. As the stagecoach rolled through the mountain passes, Clara found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The towering peaks and endless forests represented freedom from the suffocating judgment of Willowbrook, but they also symbolized the unknown dangers that lay ahead. Every mile took her further from everything familiar, deeper into a world where she would have to create her own identity. Mrs. Cartwright eventually broke the uncomfortable silence that had dominated the first day of travel. "You're awfully young to be traveling alone, dear," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness of someone fishing for information. "Are you visiting family?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She had prepared a story about visiting a sick relative, but the lie felt clumsy in her mouth. Mrs. Cartwright's sharp eyes seemed to see right through her, cataloging every detail of her appearance and manner. "I suppose your parents felt it was safe enough," Mrs. Cartwright continued, her tone suggesting that she had serious doubts about the wisdom of sending a young girl into the wilderness alone. "Though I must say, when I was your age, no respectable family would have allowed such a thing." The criticism stung, but Clara forced herself to remain silent. She couldn't afford to draw attention to herself or invite more probing questions. Instead, she turned her attention to the window, watching the landscape roll by and trying to imagine what her new life might hold. The mining town of Silver Creek was their first major stop, a rough settlement built around a series of silver mines that had been producing steadily for nearly a decade. The streets were muddy and crowded with prospectors, merchants, and the inevitable collection of gamblers and saloon girls that followed mining operations. Clara watched the activity with fascination, having never seen anything quite like it. The hotel where they stayed for the night was a ramshackle building that seemed to be held together by hope and habit. Clara's room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it was clean and provided the privacy she desperately needed. She lay awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of the mining town and wondering what kind of person she would become in this new world. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would prove crucial to Clara's future. As she waited for the stagecoach to resume its journey, she noticed a commotion near the hotel's front desk. A well-dressed woman was arguing with the clerk about the quality of her accommodation, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "This is completely unacceptable," the woman was saying, her tone crisp and commanding. "I specifically requested your best room, and this is barely fit for storing equipment." The clerk, a nervous young man with thinning hair, wrung his hands apologetically. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am, but we're completely booked due to the mining convention. That's truly the best we can offer." Clara watched the exchange with growing admiration. The woman was perhaps 40 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and clothing that spoke of wealth and refinement. But more than her appearance, it was her manner that impressed Clara. She projected an air of absolute confidence, as if she had never doubted her right to demand the best from the world. "Then I suppose I'll have to make other arrangements," the woman said finally, her voice suggesting that the hotel's loss was considerable. She turned from the desk and nearly collided with Clara, who had been standing closer than she realized. "Oh, I do apologize," the woman said, her manner softening, as she looked down at Clara's young face. "I hope I didn't startle you, dear." Clara shook her head, still tongue-tied by the woman's presence. Up close, she could see that the stranger's eyes were a remarkable shade of green, intelligent and assessing. She seemed to be taking Clara's measure in a way that was thorough but not unkind. "Are you traveling alone?" the woman asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "That seems rather dangerous for someone your age." Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Cartwright appeared at her elbow. "She's traveling to Oregon to visit family," the widow said, her protective instincts apparently overriding her earlier disapproval. "Though I must say, I share your concerns about the propriety of such an arrangement." The elegant woman nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, I'm Vivian Ashford," she said, extending her hand first to Mrs. Cartwright and then to Clara. "I'm traveling to Portland myself, though I'll be stopping in several cities along the way on business." Clara took the offered hand, surprised by the firmness of the woman's grip. "Clara Morrison," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Morrison," Vivian said, and Clara felt a flush of adult recognition at being addressed so formally. "I hope your journey proves to be everything you hope it will be." There was something in the way Vivian spoke that suggested she understood more about Clara's situation than she was letting on. Clara found herself wondering what kind of business would take such a refined woman into the frontier territories, and what experiences had given her such obvious strength and self-possession. The encounter was brief, but it left Clara with a new sense of possibility. She had never seen a woman who carried herself with such authority, who seemed to command respect through sheer force of personality. As the stagecoach resumed its journey, Clara found herself thinking about Vivian Ashford, and wondering if it was possible for a woman to create her own place in the world. The days that followed brought a series of small towns and way stations, each one a glimpse into the diverse communities that were springing up across the Western Territories. Clara began to understand that the frontier was not just a place, but a state of mind, where people could reinvent themselves and create new identities based on their actions rather than their birth dot in the town of Cedar Falls. She witnessed a heated debate in the local general store about women's suffrage. The store owner, a progressive man named Samuel Fletcher, was arguing passionately for women's right to vote, while several of his customers expressed loud opposition. Clara listened to the discussion with growing interest, particularly when a local schoolteacher named Miss Emily Watson stood up to defend her own political opinions. "I pay taxes on my property just like any man," Miss Watson declared, her voice steady despite the hostile stares she was receiving. "I fail to see why my gender should disqualify me from having a voice in how those taxes are spent." The argument that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever heard in Willowbrook. Women were actively participating in a political discussion, expressing opinions and defending their right to be heard. It was a revelation that expanded Clara's understanding of what might be possible in her new life. At the next stop, a settlement called Pine Ridge, Clara encountered another example of frontier possibility. The town's doctor was a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had trained at a medical college in the East before coming west to establish her practice. Clara watched in fascination as Dr. Mitchell examined an injured miner with the same competence and authority that she had always associated with men. "Medicine is about knowledge and skill," Dr. Mitchell explained to a group of curious onlookers. "Those qualities are not limited by gender, despite what some people might prefer to believe." Each of these encounters added to Clara's growing sense that the world was larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The rigid social structures of Willowbrook were not universal laws, but local customs, and in other places, different rules might apply. The final leg of the journey took them through the Columbia River Gorge, a spectacular landscape of towering cliffs and rushing water that seemed to epitomize the raw power of the frontier. Clara pressed her face to the window, drinking in the sight of waterfalls cascading down sheer rock faces and eagles soaring overhead. "First time seeing the gorge?" asked Jake Sullivan, the older of the two mining brothers. His voice was kind, and Clara realized that he had been watching her reaction with amusement. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The beauty of the landscape was overwhelming, but it also filled her with a strange sense of hope. This was a place where anything seemed possible, where the old rules might not apply. "It's something, isn't it?" Jake continued. "When me and Pete first came out here from Pennsylvania, we thought we knew what big country looked like. But this is different. Makes you feel like you could be anything you wanted to be." The words resonated with Clara in a way that Jake couldn't have intended. She was carrying a secret that would have marked her as ruined in Willowbrook, but perhaps in this new world, she could create a different story for herself. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Portland, Clara was surprised by what she found. The city was larger and more sophisticated than she had expected, with paved streets, gas lamps, and buildings that wouldn't have looked out of place in Chicago or St. Louis. The frontier, she realized, was not a single place but a moving boundary. And some areas that had once been wilderness were now becoming civilized. Her aunt, Ruth Morrison, was waiting at the stage depot when Clara arrived. Ruth was Thomas's older sister, a woman who had never married and had made her living as a seamstress and boarding house keeper. She was thin and sharp-featured, with graying hair and clothes that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. "So you're Thomas's girl," Ruth said, looking Clara up and down with appraising eyes. "You're smaller than I expected, but I suppose that's to be expected given your circumstances." Clara winced at the reference to her pregnancy, which was becoming more obvious despite her attempts to conceal it. She had hoped that her aunt might be more understanding than the people of Willowbrook, but Ruth's manner suggested otherwise. "I want you to understand something right from the start," Ruth continued as they walked toward her boarding house. "I'm doing this as a favor to your father, but I won't have any nonsense under my roof. You'll work for your keep, and you'll conduct yourself with appropriate discretion. I have a reputation to maintain." The boarding house was a 3-story building in a respectable part of town, with a sign that read, "Morrison House, clean rooms, and decent meals." Clara's room was on the 3rd floor, a small space under the eaves that was stifling in the summer heat. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table that served as a desk. Ruth's rules were strict and comprehensive. Clara was expected to help with cooking, cleaning, and laundry in exchange for her room and board. She was not to fraternize with the male boarders or engage in any behavior that might cause gossip. Most importantly, she was to keep her condition as private as possible until arrangements could be made for the baby's future. "There's a home for unwed mothers run by the Methodist Church," Ruth explained matter-of-factly. "You'll go there when your time comes, have the baby, and then we'll find a good family to take it. After that, You can decide what you want to do with your life." Clara nodded numbly, though the casual way her aunt discussed giving away her baby made her feel hollow inside. She had tried not to think too much about the life growing within her, but now she was forced to confront the reality of what lay ahead. The next several months passed in a blur of routine and waiting. Clara threw herself into her work at the boarding house, learning skills that she had never needed in Willowbrook. She became adept at managing laundry for a dozen people, cooking meals for diverse tastes, and maintaining the kind of order that kept a business running smoothly. The boarding house's residents were a fascinating mix of people who had come west for various reasons. There was Professor Marcus Webb, a former college instructor who was writing a book about frontier life; Mrs. Dorothy Crane, a widow who had come to Portland to be near her son's family; Samuel Torres, a young lawyer who was building a practice, defending minors' rights; and dozens of others, each with their own story and their own reasons for being far from home. Clara found herself listening to their conversations with growing fascination. These people spoke of opportunities and possibilities that she had never imagined. They discussed business ventures, political developments, and social changes that were reshaping the West. Slowly, she began to understand that the frontier was not just a place where people went to escape their past, but a laboratory where new kinds of society were being created. As her pregnancy progressed, Clara found herself thinking more and more about her future. Ruth's plan was simple and practical: have the baby, give it away, and then find some respectable employment as a domestic servant or seamstress. It was a life that would provide security and modest comfort, but it was also a life that would keep her forever in the shadows. But Clara had seen too much during her journey west to be satisfied with such a limited future. She had witnessed women who had created their own businesses, who had entered professions traditionally reserved for men, who had found ways to build lives based on their own abilities rather than society's expectations. The question that haunted her was whether she had the courage to reach for something more than the safe, conventional path that her aunt had mapped out for her. She was young, pregnant, and alone, with no money and no connections. But she was also intelligent, determined, and increasingly aware of the possibilities that surrounded her. The decision about what kind of person she would become was still ahead of her, but Clara was beginning to understand that it was a decision she would have to make for herself. The girl who had left Willowbrook in shame and defeat was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who was starting to believe that she might be capable of creating her own destiny. Winter was coming to Portland, and with it, the birth of her child. Clara Morrison was about to face the next chapter of her transformation, one that would test her resolve and ultimately determine whether she would remain a victim of circumstances or become the architect of her own remarkable future. The Portland winter of 1878 was harsh, with rain that seemed to fall endlessly and winds that cut through even the thickest wool. Clara Morrison stood at the window of her third-floor room, watching ice form on the glass while she cradled her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant now, she moved slowly and carefully, but her mind had never been sharper. The Methodist home for unwed mothers loomed in her future like an inevitable storm. Aunt Ruth had made all the arrangements with the efficiency of someone handling an unpleasant but necessary task. Clara would enter the home in 3 weeks, have her baby under the supervision of the church ladies, and then sign papers giving the child to a suitable family who could provide proper care. But as Clara watched the winter storm rage outside, she felt something hardening inside her chest. The meek acceptance that had carried her from Willowbrook was cracking, replaced by a fierce resistance that surprised her with its intensity. The transformation had begun subtly through her daily interactions with the boarding house residents. Professor Webb had been the first to treat her as something more than a fallen woman in need of charity. He had noticed her listening to his conversations about Western expansion and had begun explaining economic concepts to her. Delighted to find such an eager student, Most people think the frontier is about cowboys and gold prospectors, Professor Webb had told her one evening as she served dinner. But the real story is about capital formation and market development. The people who understand that are the ones who'll build the new West. Clara had absorbed these lessons with growing fascination. She learned about supply chains and transportation networks, about how fortunes were made not just by finding gold, but by feeding and clothing and housing the people who sought it. The professor had a collection of territorial newspapers that he shared with her, and Clara devoured every article about business ventures and commercial opportunities. Samuel Torres, the young lawyer, had been equally influential in different ways. He fought legal battles for miners who were being cheated by large mining companies, and his stories revealed the complex web of laws and regulations that governed frontier life. More importantly, he showed Clara how knowledge of the legal system could be a powerful weapon for those who understood how to use it. The law is supposed to protect everyone equally, Samuel had explained during one of their conversations. But, in practice, it protects those who know how to navigate it. That's why education is so important, especially for people who start with disadvantages. Mrs. Dorothy Crane had provided yet another perspective. The widow had come west not from desperation, but from choice, selling her late husband's business in Ohio and investing the proceeds in Portland real estate. She managed her properties herself, collecting rents and overseeing repairs with the competence of someone who had never doubted her ability to handle financial matters. People back east think women can't understand business, Mrs. Crane had told Clara while teaching her to balance the boarding house books. But money is just arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care about your gender. The trick is convincing others to take you seriously, and that comes from proving you know what you're talking about. These lessons had accumulated in Clara's mind like layers of sediment, slowly building into something solid and unshakable. She was beginning to understand that her pregnancy and exile didn't have to define her future. They were circumstances to be overcome, not permanent conditions that would limit her for life. The revelation that changed everything came on a cold February morning when Clara was helping Professor Webb organize his research materials. Hidden among his newspapers was a copy of a California publication called the Pacific Business Weekly, and one article caught Clara's eye immediately. "Local woman establishes successful mining supply company," read the headline. The story detailed how a widow named Catherine Yang had started a business providing equipment and provisions to gold miners throughout the Sierra Nevada. What made this story remarkable was not just Yang's success, but the scale of it. She had built her operation into a company worth over $50,000 in just 3 years. Clara read the article 3 times, memorizing every detail. Catherine Yang had started with nothing more than a small inheritance and an understanding of what miners needed. She had identified gaps in the supply chain and found ways to fill them more efficiently than her competitors. Most importantly, she had refused to be limited by other people's expectations about what a woman could accomplish. The article included a photograph of Yang standing in front of one of her supply warehouses, surrounded by employees and looking every inch the successful businesswoman. She was perhaps 35 years old, with an expression of quiet confidence that reminded Clara of Vivian Ashford, the elegant woman she had met during her stagecoach journey. "Professor Webb," Clara said that evening, her voice carefully controlled. "Do you think it's really possible for a woman to build a business like this, Catherine Yang?" Professor Webb looked up from his writing, considering the question seriously. "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "The frontier creates opportunities for anyone smart enough to recognize them and bold enough to act. Gender matters much less out here than it does back east, especially if you can prove your competence. But what about social expectations? What about people who might disapprove?" Professor Webb set down his pen and studied Clara's face. "My dear, if you spend your life worrying about what other people think, you'll never accomplish anything worthwhile. The question isn't whether people will approve, but whether you have the skill and determination to succeed despite their disapproval. That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, her hands resting on her stomach as the baby kicked restlessly inside her. For the first time since leaving Willowbrook, she allowed herself to imagine a different future than the one Aunt Ruth had. Plan for her. What if she didn't give up her baby? What if instead of disappearing into domestic service, she found a way to build something of her own? The West was full of stories about people who had reinvented themselves, who had overcome impossible odds to create new lives. Why couldn't she be one of them? The challenges were obvious and daunting. She had no money, no business experience, and no connections. She would be a single mother in a society that barely tolerated such situations. But she also had advantages that she was only beginning to recognize: intelligence, determination, and a growing understanding of how the frontier economy actually worked. More importantly, she had something that many people lacked: the burning motivation that came from having nothing left to lose. The respectable life she had once taken for granted was gone forever. Joshua Blackwood had made sure of that when he destroyed her reputation and abandoned her to face the consequences alone. But in destroying her old life, he had also freed her from the constraints that might have held her back. The decision crystallized on a snowy March morning when Aunt Ruth returned from her weekly meeting with the Methodist church ladies. She had news about the family that had been selected to adopt Clara's baby, a wealthy merchant and his wife, who lived in Seattle and had been unable to have children of their own. "It's a perfect arrangement," Ruth said with satisfaction. "They're respectable people with money and social standing. The child will have every advantage, and you'll be free to get on with your life without any encumbrances." The word encumbrances hit Clara like a physical blow. That was how her aunt saw the baby growing inside her, not as a person, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The casual cruelty of it sparked something fierce and protective in Clara's chest. "What if I don't want to give up the baby?" Clara asked quietly. Ruth stared at her in shock. "Don't be ridiculous. You're 15 years old with no husband and no prospects. How could you possibly care for a child? People manage somehow. Other women in difficult circumstances find ways to survive. Other women," Ruth said sharply, "don't have better options available to them. You have a chance to make a clean start, to put this mistake behind you and build a decent life. Don't throw that away for some romantic notion about motherhood." But Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Portland 7 months earlier. The education she had received from the boarding house residents had given her new ways of thinking about problems and solutions. She had learned that situations that seemed impossible often had alternatives that weren't immediately obvious. "I've been thinking about starting a business," Clara said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "There are opportunities here for someone willing to work hard and think creatively." Ruth's expression shifted from shock to alarm. "A business? Clara, you don't know the first thing about business. You're a child who made a foolish mistake, and now you're compounding it with grandiose fantasies." "I know more than you think," Clara replied. "I've been learning from Professor Webb and the others. I understand how supply and demand work, how to identify market opportunities, how to calculate profit margins." The conversation that followed was heated and painful. Ruth argued passionately for the conventional path, emphasizing the security and respectability it would provide. She painted vivid pictures of the hardships Clara would face as an unmarried mother, trying to support herself and a child in an unforgiving world. But Clara had already seen too much of what was possible to be frightened back into submission. She had watched Mrs. Crane manage her real estate investments with cool competence. She had listened to Samuel Torres describe how knowledge and determination could overcome even significant disadvantages. Most importantly, She had read about Catherine Yang and dozens of other women who had created their own opportunities in the expanding West. The argument ended with Ruth delivering an ultimatum: follow the plan that had been arranged, or find somewhere else to live. It was the same kind of forced choice that had driven Clara from Willowbrook, but this time her response was different. "I'll find somewhere else to live," Clara said quietly. Ruth's face went white with shock. She had clearly expected her ultimatum to force Clara into compliance, not trigger her departure. "You can't be serious. Where would you go? How would you survive?" Clara didn't have complete answers to those questions, but she had the beginning of a plan. Professor Webb had mentioned that one of his acquaintances, a newspaper editor named Benjamin Hayes, was looking for someone to help with bookkeeping and correspondence. The pay was modest, but it would be enough to rent a small room and cover basic expenses. More importantly, working for a newspaper would give her access to information about business opportunities throughout the region. She could learn about new settlements that needed supplies, about mining operations that required specialized equipment, about transportation routes that were being developed. Knowledge was the foundation of opportunity, and a newspaper was a perfect place to acquire it. The confrontation with her aunt forced Clara to accelerate her timeline, but it also clarified her priorities in a way that might not have happened otherwise. She was going to keep her baby, and she was going to find a way to build a life that would provide security and opportunity for both of them. 2 weeks later, Clara Morrison walked out of her aunt's boarding house carrying a small suitcase and wearing the same dress she had worn on the stagecoach from Willowbrook. But she was no longer the same person who had made that journey. The frightened, defeated girl was gone, replaced by a young woman who had learned to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Benjamin Hayes was a progressive man in his 50s who had come west from Boston to start a newspaper dedicated to honest reporting about frontier development. He interviewed Clara in his cluttered office above the print shop, surrounded by stacks of papers and the constant noise of the printing press below. "Mrs. Morrison tells me you're intelligent and hardworking," Hayes said, using the title that Clara had decided to adopt to avoid questions about her marital status. "But I should warn you that this job requires long hours and attention to detail. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied without hesitation. "I'm very prepared to work hard." Hayes studied her for a moment, perhaps noting something in her voice that spoke of unusual determination. "Very well. We'll start you at $8 a week, with the understanding that we'll review your performance in a month. If you prove yourself capable, there may be opportunities for additional responsibilities." Clara accepted the position immediately, and within days she had found a small apartment above a bakery in a working-class neighborhood. It wasn't much, 2 rooms with basic furnishings and a view of an alley, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she was completely independent, supporting herself through her own efforts. The work at the newspaper was demanding but fascinating. Clara managed correspondence with sources throughout the Oregon Territory, maintained subscription records, and helped prepare copy for publication. But most valuable of all, she had access to information about economic developments across the entire region. She read every edition of every newspaper that came through the office, absorbing details about new railroad routes, mining discoveries, timber operations, and agricultural developments. She began to see patterns and connections that others missed, opportunities that existed in the gaps between established businesses. As her pregnancy entered its final weeks, Clara felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the approaching birth. She was preparing to enter a new phase of her life, one where she would be responsible not just for herself, but for another person as well. The challenge was enormous, but so was her determination to succeed. The girl who had been banished from Willowbrook in shame was about to become a mother and an entrepreneur, 2 roles that would require every ounce of strength and intelligence she possessed. Clara Morrison was ready to discover just how much she was capable of achieving when she stopped accepting other people's limitations and started creating her own possibilities. The baby was due any day now, and with it would come the next chapter of a transformation that had already exceeded anything the people of Willowbrook could have imagined. Clara was no longer running from her past. She was building a future that would eventually allow her to confront it on her own terms. The labor began on a rainy April morning while Clara was sorting through shipping manifests at the newspaper office. The first contraction caught her by surprise, a sharp pain that doubled her over her desk. Benjamin Hayes looked up from his writing with concern, noting the pallor that had suddenly spread across her face. "Mrs. Morrison, are you quite all right?" he asked, rising from his chair. Clara gripped the edge of her desk, breathing carefully through the pain. She had been dreading this moment, not because of the physical ordeal ahead, but because of the vulnerability it represented. For months, she had been building her independence, proving her competence in the working world. Now she would be forced back into the realm of women's traditional concerns, at least temporarily. "I believe the baby is coming," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Hayes immediately sprang into action, sending his assistant to fetch Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the woman physician Clara had specifically requested for her delivery. It was an unconventional choice that had raised eyebrows throughout Portland's medical community, but Clara had been adamant. She wanted her child brought into the world by someone who understood what it meant to challenge expectations. The labor lasted 18 hours, and through it all, Clara maintained the same fierce determination that had carried her through the previous months. Dr. Mitchell later told colleagues that she had never attended a birth where the mother seemed so focused on the future rather than the immediate pain. When her daughter finally arrived, tiny and red-faced and perfect, Clara felt something shift fundamentally inside her chest. This wasn't just a baby she was looking at. It was her partner in the enterprise of creating a new life. She held the infant close, marveling at the delicate features and the strength of the small hands that gripped her finger. "What will you name her?" Dr. Mitchell asked as she cleaned up after the delivery. Clara had been thinking about this question for weeks. She wanted a name that would give her daughter strength, something that spoke of capability and independence. "Elizabeth," she said finally. "Elizabeth Morrison. A strong name for what I suspect will be a strong young lady," Dr. Mitchell observed with a smile. The weeks that followed Elizabeth's birth were perhaps the most challenging of Clara's life. She had severely underestimated the physical and emotional demands of caring for an infant while trying to maintain her job at the newspaper. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and there were moments when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in rejecting her aunt's practical advice. But each time doubt crept in, Clara would look at her daughter and remember why she had chosen this difficult path. Elizabeth represented possibility, a chance to raise someone who would never have to accept other people's limitations as permanent facts. This child would grow up knowing that women could build businesses, make their own decisions, and create their own destinies. Benjamin Hayes proved to be more understanding than Clara had dared hope. When she explained her situation honestly, that she was an unmarried mother who desperately needed to keep working, he surprised her with his response. "Mrs. Morrison," he said thoughtfully, "I've been watching your work for several months now, and I've come to rely on your insights about regional business developments. It would be foolish of me to lose such a valuable employee over something as natural as childbirth." Hayes allowed Clara to bring Elizabeth to the office when necessary, setting up a small cradle in the corner where the baby could sleep while her mother worked. It was an arrangement that scandalized some of their more conservative advertisers, but Hayes stood firm in his support. More importantly, the presence of Elizabeth in the office led to unexpected opportunities. Women throughout Portland began stopping by to see the baby, and many of them lingered to chat with Clara about business and social issues. She discovered that there was a network of enterprising women in the city who were quietly building their own commercial ventures, while their male counterparts received all the public attention. Through these connections, Clara learned about Sarah Whitman, who had established a successful laundry service that catered specifically to the city's growing population of single men. There was Margaret Foster, who had turned her skill at preserving foods into a thriving business supplying ships and mining camps, and dozens of others, each finding ways to monetize skills that society traditionally considered merely domestic. These women became Clara's informal advisors and eventual business partners. They shared information about suppliers, customers, and opportunities with the generosity of people who understood that success was not a limited resource. The more successful women there were in Portland, the easier it became for all of them to be taken seriously. It was Margaret Foster who first suggested that Clara consider entering the food preservation business. The mining camps scattered throughout Oregon and Washington were desperate for reliable supplies of preserved meats, fruits, and vegetables. The work was demanding and required significant startup capital, but the profit margins were substantial for those who could master the techniques. The secret isn't just knowing how to preserve food, Margaret explained during one of their conversations. It's understanding the logistics of getting your products to market before they spoil. Most people who fail in this business do so because they can't solve the transportation puzzle. Clara spent her evenings studying every piece of information she could find about food preservation techniques and transportation routes. She read technical manuals about canning and smoking processes, studied railroad schedules and shipping costs, and calculated profit margins on different types of preserved goods. But she also recognized that she needed more than theoretical knowledge to succeed. She needed practical experience and sufficient capital to establish her operation. With Elizabeth now 6 months old and becoming more manageable, Clara began working part-time for Margaret Foster, learning the intricacies of the preservation business while earning money to fund her own venture. The work was physically demanding in ways that her job at the newspaper had never been. She spent long hours in steamy preservation rooms, monitoring temperatures and timing processes with scientific precision. Her hands became permanently stained from handling various chemicals and spices, and her back ached from lifting heavy containers of processed foods. But Clara had never been happier. For the first time since leaving Willowbrook, she was building something that was entirely her own. Every skill she mastered, every process she perfected, every dollar she saved brought her closer to the independence she craved. Elizabeth thrived in this environment, surrounded by women who treated business as naturally as breathing. The baby's first words were "mama" and "money," which caused great amusement among Clara's colleagues. More importantly, Elizabeth was growing up in an atmosphere where female competence was assumed rather than questioned. By Elizabeth's first birthday, Clara had saved enough money to rent a small facility and purchase basic equipment for her own food preservation operation. She chose a location near the railroad depot, understanding that proximity to transportation was crucial for her planned expansion into the mining camp market. Morrison's Premium Provisions opened for business on a cold November morning in 1880. Clara's first customers were 3 ship captains who needed preserved foods for extended voyages. But word of her quality products spread quickly through Portland's commercial district. What set Clara apart from her competitors was not just the quality of her preservation techniques, but her understanding of market dynamics that she had learned during her time at the newspaper. She knew which mining camps were expanding and would need increased food supplies. She understood the seasonal patterns of different industries and could anticipate demand fluctuations months in advance. Most importantly, she had learned to think strategically about business relationships. Instead of simply selling to whoever placed orders, Clara actively cultivated partnerships with transportation companies, mining suppliers, and other businesses that could provide mutual referrals. The breakthrough came when she secured a contract to supply preserved foods to the Northern Pacific Railroad construction crews working on the mountain passes. It was a massive order that would require her to expand her operation significantly, but it also represented the kind of steady, large-scale business that could establish her company as a major regional supplier. Clara threw herself into fulfilling the railroad contract with the same intensity she had once applied to escaping Willowbrook. She hired additional workers, purchased more equipment, and established quality control procedures that ensured every shipment met her exacting standards. The work was exhausting, but every successful delivery brought her closer to the kind of financial security that would protect both her and Elizabeth from the vulnerabilities that had once threatened to destroy them. Elizabeth, now walking and beginning to talk in full sentences, spent her days in the facility surrounded by the bustle of commercial activity. She learned to count by helping workers organize inventory, and her first understanding of geography came from studying the maps that showed where Morrison's products were being shipped. "Mama work," Elizabeth would announce proudly to visitors, pointing to the preservation vats and shipping containers that filled the warehouse space. "Mama make food for hungry people." The success of Morrison's premium provisions brought Clara to the attention of Portland's business establishment in ways that both thrilled and concerned her. Newspaper articles began mentioning her company as an example of innovative frontier enterprise, but they also raised questions about her personal circumstances that made her uncomfortable. Clara had become adept at deflecting inquiries about her late husband and the circumstances that had brought her to Portland. She had created a carefully constructed persona as a young widow who had turned to business out of necessity, a story that generated sympathy while explaining her unusual independence. But success also brought scrutiny, and Clara knew that her fabricated history might not withstand detailed investigation. The business world she was entering was still dominated by men who might not be as understanding as Benjamin Hayes had been about her unconventional circumstances. The solution came from an unexpected source. Samuel Torres, the lawyer who had lived at her aunt's boarding house, had established a successful practice representing mining interests throughout the territory. When he learned about Clara's business success, he approached her with a proposition that would solve several problems at once. "Mrs. Morrison," he said during a meeting in his law office, "I've been following your company's progress with great interest. I think there might be opportunities for us to work together in ways that would benefit both our enterprises." Samuel's proposal was elegant and practical. His law firm would handle the legal and contractual aspects of Clara's business expansion, while Morrison's premium provisions would have access to information about new mining operations that might need food supply contracts. More importantly, Samuel's endorsement would provide Clara with the kind of professional credibility that could shield her from unwanted personal scrutiny. The partnership proved beneficial beyond Clara's wildest expectations. Samuel's legal expertise helped her navigate complex multi-state contracts, while his connections in the mining industry opened doors to opportunities she might never have discovered on her own. Within 2 years of opening Morrison's Premium Provisions, Clara had built it into one of the largest food supply companies in the Pacific Northwest. Her products were shipped to mining camps throughout Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. She employed over 40 people and had established satellite operations in 3 different cities. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven to herself that the frightened girl who had fled Willowbrook was truly dead and buried. In her place stood a businesswoman who commanded respect through competence, who had built financial security through intelligence and determination, and who was raising a daughter who would never doubt that women could achieve anything they set their minds to accomplish. Elizabeth was now 3 years old, bright and curious, and completely unaware that her existence had once been considered a shameful secret. She spoke confidently to adults, showed remarkable facility with numbers, and displayed the kind of self-assurance that came from growing up in an environment where her mother's authority was never questioned. Clara, often thought about the people she had left behind in Willowbrook, wondering what they would think if they could see her now. The girl they had cast out in disgrace had built something remarkable from nothing, had proven that their judgment had been not just cruel but completely wrong. But Clara wasn't ready to confront her past just yet. She was still building, still growing, still proving to herself that she could achieve heights that no one in Willowbrook had ever imagined possible. The reckoning with Joshua Blackwood and the town that had betrayed her would come eventually. But when it did, Clara Morrison would face them not as a victim seeking vindication, but as a woman of power and influence who had long since surpassed anything they could offer or take away. The transformation was nearly complete, but the most dramatic chapters of Clara's story were still to come. By 1885, Clara Morrison had become a name whispered with respect and envy throughout the Pacific Northwest business community. Morrison's premium provisions had evolved from a small Portland operation into a commercial empire spanning 4 states, with subsidiary companies that touched everything from transportation to banking. Elizabeth, now 6 years old, accompanied her mother to business meetings with the confidence of someone who had never questioned women's right to command boardrooms. She would sit quietly in the corner of Clara's office, sketching in her notebooks while contracts worth thousands of dollars were negotiated around her. The child had absorbed lessons about commerce and strategy simply by breathing the air of her mother's world. Clara's latest venture was perhaps her most audacious yet: the establishment of the Pacific Transport Company, a freight and passenger service that would connect the scattered mining communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The idea had come to her during a particularly frustrating delay in getting her food supplies to a new copper mine in Montana. If she couldn't rely on existing transportation services to meet her standards, she would create her own. The meeting that would change everything took place in the marble-appointed office of Harrison Wells, president of the First National Bank of Portland. Wells was a portly man in his 60s who had built his reputation on conservative lending practices and careful risk assessment. He was not the type of banker who typically backed unconventional ventures, especially those proposed by women. "Mrs. Morrison," Wells said, reviewing the detailed proposal Clara had submitted, "I must admit that your track record speaks for itself. Morrison's premium provisions has consistently exceeded its revenue projections, and your loan payments have been exemplary." Clara sat across from him, wearing a tailored navy dress that conveyed both professionalism and affluence. Elizabeth was at her private school, where she was learning French and advanced mathematics alongside the daughters of Portland's most prominent families. The transformation from the frightened pregnant girl who had arrived in the city 7 years earlier was so complete that sometimes Clara herself could barely believe it. "However," Wells continued, "what you're proposing here is an entirely different scale of operation. A transportation company requires massive capital investment, significant operational expertise, and the ability to navigate complex regulatory environments across multiple territories." Clara had anticipated this objection. She opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of documents that represented months of meticulous research and planning. "I've secured preliminary agreements with 17 mining operations across Montana, Idaho, and Eastern Oregon. The combined value of these contracts would generate approximately $120,000 in revenue during the first year alone." Wells's eyebrows rose at the figure. It was more than some established Portland businesses generated in 5 years. He studied the contracts Clara had provided, noting the careful legal language and the impressive list of signatories. "Where did you obtain the expertise to negotiate agreements of this complexity?" he asked, his tone shifting from skepticism to genuine curiosity. "I've been working with Samuel Torres's law firm for 3 years, Clara replied. "But more importantly, I've been studying every aspect of the transportation industry since I first identified this opportunity. I understand the logistics, the regulatory requirements, and the financial structure's better than most people who are already in the business. What Clara didn't mention was the network of relationships she had cultivated throughout the region. Her food supply business had given her access to mining camp managers, railroad executives, and territorial officials who made the decisions about transportation contracts. She had spent years listening to their complaints about existing services and quietly identifying the gaps she could fill. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, with Wells probing every aspect of Clara's business plan while she provided detailed responses backed by comprehensive research. By the end of the meeting, the banker's initial skepticism had been replaced by something approaching awe. "Mrs. Morrison," he said finally, "I've reviewed hundreds of business proposals over the years, and I can honestly say that yours is among the most thoroughly prepared and strategically sound I've encountered. The bank will be pleased to provide the financing you've requested." The loan was for $75,000, a sum that would have been unimaginable to the girl who had once worried about affording stagecoach fare to Oregon. But Clara had learned to think in terms of systems and scale, to see opportunities that others missed because they were thinking too small. Within 6 months, the Pacific Transport Company had purchased a fleet of wagons, hired experienced drivers, and established way stations along the primary routes between Portland and the major mining regions. Clara had studied the successful transportation companies in California and Colorado, adapting their best practices while innovating solutions to problems they hadn't encountered. The key to her success was understanding that transportation was really about information. Customers didn't just want their goods moved from one place to another. They wanted to know when shipments would arrive, what condition they would be in, and how much the service would cost. Clara established a communication system using telegraph lines and mounted messengers that kept customers informed about their shipments in real time. More importantly, she had identified a crucial gap in the market that her male competitors had overlooked. The mining camps desperately needed reliable passenger service for the families of workers, the traveling merchants who supplied various goods, and the territorial officials who needed to move between communities. But existing services focused almost exclusively on freight, treating passenger transport as an afterthought. Clara designed her operations around the needs of people as well as cargo. Her coaches were more comfortable than the competition. Her drivers were trained in customer service as well as navigation, and her way stations provided amenities that made long journeys bearable for women and children. The innovation that truly set Pacific Transport apart was Clara's decision to hire women as station managers. While men handled the physical demands of loading cargo and maintaining equipment, women managed customer relations, scheduling, and the complex logistics of coordinating multiple routes simultaneously. The arrangement scandalized some of her competitors and customers, but it proved brilliantly effective. Women who traveled on Clara's routes felt safer and more comfortable, while male passengers appreciated the attention to detail and service quality that her female managers provided. More importantly, Clara had discovered that women were often better than men at managing the complex scheduling and communication challenges that kept a transportation network running smoothly. Elizabeth thrived in this expanding empire, spending her school holidays traveling the routes with her mother and learning the business from the ground up. She could calculate freight rates in her head, knew the names of dozens of mining operations, and spoke easily with everyone from territorial governors to freight handlers. "Mama," Elizabeth said one evening as they reviewed shipping manifests, "together, why don't more ladies run companies like you do?" Clara considered the question carefully. Her daughter was growing up in a world where female business leadership was normal, but Clara remembered all too well how rare and controversial such arrangements actually were. "Many women have the ability," Clara explained, "but they haven't had the opportunities to prove it. Most people still believe that women should focus on taking care of homes and families rather than building businesses." "That seems foolish," Elizabeth observed with the directness of childhood. Women are just as smart as men, and sometimes they pay attention to things that men don't notice. Clara smiled at her daughter's confidence. Elizabeth would never doubt her own capabilities the way Clara had once doubted hers. That alone made all the struggles and sacrifices worthwhile. The success of Pacific Transport brought Clara to the attention of business leaders throughout the Western Territories. She received invitations to investment meetings in San Francisco, consulted with railroad executives about route development, and found herself mentioned in territorial newspapers as an example of innovative frontier entrepreneurship. But success also brought complications she hadn't anticipated. The territorial governor of Montana, James Richardson, had taken a personal interest in Clara's business operations, ostensibly because of their importance to the region's mining industry. Richardson was a widower in his 40s, politically ambitious and socially prominent, and he had begun making it clear that his interest in Clara extended beyond the purely professional. "Mrs. Morrison," Governor Richardson said during one of their meetings in Helena, "I hope you'll consider my invitation to the territorial capital's harvest celebration. It's an important social event, and your presence would be ... most welcome." Clara understood the subtext perfectly. Richardson was offering her access to the highest levels of political and social influence in the territory, but the price would be accepting his romantic attention and eventually his marriage proposal. It was the kind of arrangement that would provide security and respectability while limiting her independence. The irony wasn't lost on her. 7 years earlier, she would have been grateful for any respectable man's attention. Now, as a successful businesswoman with her own power and influence, she found herself reluctant to compromise her autonomy for the sake of social convention. "Governor Richardson," Clara replied diplomatically, "I'm flattered by your invitation, but my business responsibilities require most of my attention these days. Perhaps when things are less demanding." Richardson's expression tightened slightly, suggesting that he wasn't accustomed to having his advances deflected. "Of course, but I hope you'll remember that business success is much easier to maintain with the right kind of political support." The implicit threat was clear, and Clara filed it away for future consideration. She had learned that power always generated opposition, and she needed to be prepared for challenges that might come from unexpected directions. Meanwhile, her network of female business associates had grown into an informal but influential organization. Women throughout the Pacific Northwest shared information about opportunities and challenges, provided mutual support during difficult periods, and increasingly acted as a unified voice on issues that affected their commercial interests. This network proved invaluable when Clara faced her first serious business crisis. A competitor, backed by established railroad interests, had begun undercutting Pacific Transport's prices while spreading rumors about the reliability of a company managed by a woman. The campaign was systematic and well-funded, designed to drive Clara out of the transportation business before she could become too entrenched. Clara's response demonstrated how much she had learned about strategic thinking since her early days in Portland. Instead of engaging in a destructive price war, she leveraged her relationships with mining companies to secure long-term, exclusive contracts that guaranteed her revenue regardless of competitive pressure. She also used her network of female associates to generate counter-publicity that highlighted her company's superior service record. But most importantly, Clara had learned to think several moves ahead of her opponents. While they were focused on destroying her transportation business, she was quietly developing plans for her next venture, a mining operation of her own. The opportunity had emerged from her extensive travels throughout the mining regions. Clara had noticed that most operations focused on extracting the most obvious and accessible ore deposits while ignoring smaller sites that might be profitable with the right approach. She had been discreetly purchasing mineral rights to such properties, planning to use the profits from her transportation and food businesses to fund a mining operation that would employ more efficient extraction techniques. The plan was ambitious, beyond anything she had previously attempted. But Clara had learned that success often came from recognizing opportunities that others overlooked because they seemed too difficult or unconventional. As 1885 drew to a close, Clara Morrison stood at the pinnacle of regional business success. She controlled companies worth over $250,000, employed hundreds of people across 4 states, and had the ear of territorial officials throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Elizabeth, now 7, was fluent in French and German, could solve complex mathematical equations, and spoke confidently about business strategy and market analysis. She represented the next generation of women who would take female leadership for granted rather than fighting for it. But Clara had never forgotten the injustices that had driven her from Willowbrook, or the people who had abandoned her when she needed them most. Success had given her the power to confront her past, but it had also taught her the importance of choosing the right moment for such confrontations. News from Montana had reached her through business channels. Joshua Blackwood had inherited his father's ranch and expanded it into one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He had married Rebecca Chambers as planned, and they had 3 children who were being raised in the comfort and privilege that had once seemed destined for Clara herself. Thomas Morrison had died 2 years earlier, and his blacksmith shop had been sold to pay his debts. Margaret Morrison had moved in with her sister in Utah, her health broken by years of grief and shame over her daughter's disgrace. Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions when she learned about her parents' fate. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were tempered by understanding of the impossible position her pregnancy had created for them. They had been products of their time and place, just as she had been forced to become something entirely new. But Joshua Blackwood was a different matter entirely. He had made deliberate choices to destroy her reputation and abandon her to face the consequences alone. The boy who had promised her love and marriage had become a man who had built his comfortable life on the foundation of her suffering. Clara Morrison was no longer the powerless girl who could be discarded when she became inconvenient. She was a woman with influence, resources, and the strategic thinking necessary to settle old debts when the time was right. That time was approaching, but Clara was patient. She had learned that the most effective revenge was success, and she was far from finished building her empire. When she finally returned to confront the past, it would be on her terms, with the kind of power that could reshape the future as well as settle old scores. The girl who had left Willowbrook in a stagecoach was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned to turn every disadvantage into opportunity, every setback into motivation for greater achievement. Soon, very soon, it would be time to show the people of Willowbrook exactly what they had lost when they chose to cast out Clara Morrison, the opportunity that would finally bring Clara Morrison back to Willowbrook came in the form of a telegram delivered to her Portland office on a crisp October morning, 1891. Elizabeth, now 12 and already showing the sharp business instincts her mother had cultivated, was reviewing shipping schedules when the messenger arrived. "Mama," Elizabeth said, looking up from her calculations, "Mr. Henderson is here with an urgent message." The telegram was from Nathan Prescott, Clara's mining engineer in Montana, and its contents made her pulse quicken with anticipation. Copper strike confirmed in Willowbrook Valley. Local ranchers desperate to sell mineral rights. Recommend immediate action before news spreads. Clara set the telegram down carefully, her mind already racing through the implications. After 13 years of building her empire, fate had presented her with the perfect reason to return to the town that had cast her out. But this wouldn't be a simple homecoming. It would be a calculated business acquisition that would give her control over the economic future of everyone who had wronged her. "Elizabeth," Clara said, her voice steady despite the excitement building in her chest, "please ask Mr. Torres to come to the office immediately. And send word to Captain Morrison that we'll need the fastest coach and our best team for a journey to Montana." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the tone that meant her mother was about to make one of the bold moves that had built their empire. "Is this about the telegram, Mama? Are we going to buy another mine?" "Something like that," Clara replied with a smile that would have made her competitors nervous. "We're going to buy an entire valley." The preparation took 3 days, during which Clara assembled the most comprehensive business assault ever launched against a single territory. She studied geological surveys, legal documents, and property records with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. More importantly, she researched the current financial status of every major landowner in the Willowbrook area. What she discovered exceeded her most optimistic expectations. The cattle industry that had made the Blackwood family wealthy was struggling against falling prices and increased competition from larger operations. Several of the smaller ranchers were facing bankruptcy, while even the more successful families were heavily mortgaged and vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. Joshua Blackwood's situation was particularly interesting. His ranch was still profitable, but barely so, and he had borrowed heavily to expand his operations just as the market began to decline. According to Clara's sources, he owed substantial sums to banks in both Helena and Denver, with payment schedules that would become problematic if his cash flow were disrupted. "The timing is perfect," Samuel Torres observed as he reviewed Clara's research. "The copper discovery gives us leverage to force sales, while the ranchers' financial difficulties make them vulnerable to the right kind of offers." Clara's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison Mining Enterprises would approach the struggling ranchers with generous offers for their mineral rights, providing immediate cash to solve their financial problems. But the contracts would include provisions that gave Clara's company significant control over land use and development, effectively making her the economic power behind the entire valley. The beauty of the strategy was that it appeared to benefit everyone involved. The ranchers would receive much-needed capital. The territory would gain a major mining operation that would bring jobs and development, and Clara would finally have the means to confront the people who had destroyed her family. Elizabeth listened to these discussions with the fascination of someone learning advanced techniques in a field she planned to master. At 12, she already understood concepts of leverage, market manipulation, and strategic timing that most adults never grasped. "Mama," Elizabeth said as they prepared for departure, "why is this place so important to you? We have bigger mining operations in Colorado and Idaho." Clara considered how much to tell her daughter about their shared history. Elizabeth knew the basic story, that they had lived in Montana before moving to Portland, and that Clara's parents had died while they were away, but she had never learned about the circumstances that had driven them from Willowbrook, or about the father whose existence Clara had carefully concealed. "Sometimes," Clara said carefully, "we have to go back to places that once caused us pain in order to prove that we've grown beyond their ability to hurt us. This isn't just about copper, Elizabeth. It's about showing people who once thought they could destroy us that they were very, very wrong." The journey to Montana took them along routes that Clara's own transportation company had pioneered. They traveled in a custom-built coach that served as a mobile office, complete with filing cabinets, communication equipment, and sleeping quarters. That allowed Clara to conduct business even while covering vast distances. The landscape had changed dramatically since Clara's first journey west 13 years earlier. Towns had grown into cities, mining camps had become permanent settlements, and railroad lines connected communities that had once been isolated by weeks of dangerous travel. Clara had played a role in many of these developments, her various businesses contributing to the infrastructure that was transforming the frontier into civilized territory. As they approached the Willowbrook Valley, Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions that she hadn't expected. The mountains were the same, still towering and majestic against the Montana sky. The valley itself remained beautiful, with rolling grasslands and clear streams that had once seemed like paradise to a young girl who thought she would spend her entire life there. But Clara Morrison was no longer that girl, and she was about to prove it in ways that would shock everyone who remembered her. They established their headquarters at the Mountain View Hotel in Cedar Springs, a town that had grown up around a railroad junction about 20 miles from Willowbrook. Clara chose the location carefully, close enough to conduct business efficiently, but far enough away to maintain the element of surprise until she was ready to reveal her identity. The first phase of her plan unfolded with military precision. Nathan Prescott had already confirmed the extent of the copper deposits, which were substantial enough to support mining operations for decades. More importantly, the geological survey suggested that similar deposits likely existed throughout the valley, making control of the entire area potentially worth millions of dollars. Clara's agents began approaching ranchers with carefully crafted offers that seemed almost too good to be true. Morrison Mining Enterprises was willing to pay premium prices for mineral rights while allowing the current owners to continue ranching operations on the surface. The contracts were complex but appeared to favor the landowners, with substantial upfront payments and ongoing royalties that would provide steady income for years. What the ranchers didn't understand was that the mining operations Clara planned would fundamentally change the character of the entire valley. New towns would spring up around the mines, bringing thousands of workers and their families. Railroad spurs would be built to transport ore to processing facilities. The quiet pastoral community that had existed for decades would be transformed into a bustling industrial center. The transformation would make Clara the most powerful person in the region, with economic influence that extended far beyond her mining operations. She would control employment for thousands of people, influence transportation and communication networks, and have the ear of territorial officials who depended on mining revenues for their budgets. But before she could implement these grand plans, Clara needed to secure the mineral rights from the key landowners in the valley. And that meant dealing with Joshua Blackwood. The approach to the Blackwood Ranch required careful choreography. Clara couldn't simply arrive unannounced. Too much depended on managing Joshua's reaction to her reappearance. Instead, she sent Nathan Prescott and Samuel Torres to conduct the initial negotiations, presenting themselves as representatives of a Portland-based mining concern that preferred to keep its ownership confidential. Joshua Blackwood was now 32 years old, no longer the golden boy who had once charmed his way through Willowbrook social circles. The pressures of managing a struggling ranch had aged him prematurely, adding lines around his eyes and a hardness to his features that spoke of financial stress and disappointed expectations. "Gentlemen," Joshua said as he welcomed Clara's representatives into his ranch house parlor, "I must admit that your telegram intrigued me. Mining hasn't been a consideration for this land before, but if there's copper under my pastures, I'd be foolish not to explore the possibilities." The parlor where the meeting took place was elegantly furnished, but showed signs of the careful economy that characterized families trying to maintain appearances despite financial difficulties. Clara had instructed her agents to take note of such details, understanding that Joshua's psychological state would be crucial to the success of their negotiations. "Mr. Blackwood," Nathan Prescott began, "our geological surveys suggest that your property sits atop one of the richest copper deposits we've encountered in the territory. We're prepared to offer terms that would provide substantial immediate compensation along with ongoing royalties that could support your ranching operations indefinitely." The offer they presented was strategically calibrated to appeal to Joshua's immediate needs while obscuring the long-term implications. Morrison Mining would pay $50,000 upfront for mineral rights, plus royalties that could amount to hundreds of thousands more over the life of the mining operation. For a man facing mortgage payments that threatened his family's security, it seemed like salvation. But Joshua Blackwood hadn't survived 13 years of frontier ranching without developing some business instincts of his own. He studied the contract carefully, asking probing questions about the mining company's background and long-term plans for the valley. "This Morrison Mining Enterprises," Joshua said thoughtfully. "I'm not familiar with them. What other operations have they developed?" Samuel Torres had prepared for this question. "They're a subsidiary of Morrison Holdings, which operates throughout the Pacific Northwest. Very successful company, excellent reputation. They prefer to keep a low profile to avoid speculation that might drive up land prices." The explanation was plausible, and Joshua's financial pressures made him want to believe it. But something nagged at him about the name Morrison, a familiarity that he couldn't quite place. The negotiations continued for 3 days, with Joshua consulting his wife Rebecca and reviewing the terms with his own attorney. The Blackwood family's financial situation was even worse than Clara's intelligence had suggested. Joshua owed nearly $40,000 to various creditors, with payment schedules that would force him to sell substantial portions of his ranch within the next year unless he found alternative sources of income. Rebecca Blackwood, once the pampered daughter of a wealthy cattle baron, had aged less gracefully than her husband. The years of economic uncertainty had left her brittle and demanding, constantly reminding Joshua of the comfortable life she had expected when she married into the Blackwood family. "Joshua," Rebecca said during one of their private discussions, "we can't afford to pass up this opportunity. If we don't take their offer, we might lose everything anyway." It was exactly the kind of pressure that Clara had hoped to create. The Blackwoods were being forced to choose between accepting her terms or facing financial ruin through circumstances that were largely beyond their control. On the 4th day, Joshua Blackwood signed the contract that gave Morrison Mining Enterprises complete mineral rights to his property in exchange for the $50,000 payment and future royalties. He had no way of knowing that he had just signed away his family's economic future to the girl he had abandoned and destroyed 13 years earlier. But Clara's moment of revelation was still to come. She planned to complete the acquisition of mineral rights throughout the valley before announcing her presence, ensuring that no one could withdraw from agreements once they understood who they were really dealing with. The other ranchers proved easier to negotiate with than Joshua had been. Most of them were in even worse financial condition, and several jumped at the chance to sign contracts that would provide immediate relief from their creditors. Within 2 weeks, Clara had secured mineral rights to over 80% of the land in the Willowbrook Valley. Elizabeth watched these proceedings with fascination, beginning to understand the scope of her mother's achievement. "Mama," she said one evening as they reviewed the day's acquisitions, "you're not just buying mines, are you? You're buying the whole place where you used to live." Clara nodded, impressed as always by her daughter's insight. "Yes, Elizabeth. And tomorrow we're going to visit it for the first time in 13 years. The return to Willowbrook was scheduled for a crisp November morning that reminded Clara of the day she had left as a frightened pregnant girl. But this time she would arrive in her own elegant coach, accompanied by her brilliant daughter and armed with contracts that made her the economic ruler of everyone who had once cast her out. As their coach rolled down the familiar main street, Clara felt a sense of completion that had been building for over a decade. The girl who had fled in shame was returning as a woman of power, ready to settle accounts that had been waiting far too long for resolution. The people of Willowbrook were about to discover that Clara Morrison had not only survived her exile, she had thrived beyond their wildest imagination, and she was back to claim what had always been rightfully hers. The Morrison Holdings coach rolled down Willowbrook's main street at precisely 10 o'clock on a clear November morning, its polished black exterior and brass fittings gleaming in the mountain sunlight. Behind the driver sat 2 figures that would soon transform the quiet frontier town forever. Clara Morrison, now 27 and radiating the confidence of a woman who controlled an empire worth over $500,000, and her 12-year-old daughter Elizabeth, whose intelligent eyes took in every detail of the place that had shaped her mother's destiny. Clara had chosen this moment carefully. It was market day, when the town's residents gathered at Henderson's general store to conduct their weekly business and exchange gossip. By arriving now, she would ensure maximum visibility for her return while catching people in a setting where news would spread quickly throughout the community. The coach came to a stop directly in front of the store where, 13 years earlier, the town council had met to decide Clara's fate. She stepped down with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances, her emerald green traveling dress marking her as a woman of substantial means. Elizabeth followed, her posture and bearing already showing the confidence of someone raised in privilege and power. The first person to recognize Clara was Mrs. Helen Cartwright, the widow who had shared her stagecoach journey to Oregon so many years before. Mrs. Cartwright was now in her 70s, her hair completely white but her sharp eyes still missing nothing of interest that happened in Willowbrook. "Dear Lord," Mrs. Cartwright whispered, her hand flying to her throat. That can't be ... But it was. Clara Morrison had returned, and the transformation was so complete that several people walked past her without recognition. The frightened 13-year-old who had left in tears and shame had been replaced by a woman who commanded attention simply by existing. Word of her presence spread through the gathered crowd like wildfire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the impossible sight before them. According to the stories that had been told and retold over the years, Clara Morrison had disappeared into the wilderness to face a fate that respectable people didn't discuss in polite company. She should have been broken, destitute, probably dead. Instead, she was clearly prosperous, confident, and accompanied by a well-dressed daughter who bore a striking resemblance to the girl Clara had once been. Reverend Patterson, now aged and bent, but still serving as the town's moral authority, was among the first to approach. His face showed a mixture of shock and something that might have been guilt as he recognized the woman he had once condemned from his pulpit. "Clara?" he said uncertainly. "Clara Morrison? Is it really you?" Clara turned to face the minister with a smile that held no warmth. "Reverend Patterson, how kind of you to remember me. Though I suspect my return isn't quite what you predicted during those sermons about the wages of sin." The barb hit its mark, and Patterson's face flushed with discomfort. He had indeed preached about Clara's fate, using her story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of moral transgression. Seeing her alive, successful, and clearly unrepentant challenged the narrative he had constructed around her disgrace. We thought. That is, we heard you had gone to Oregon," Patterson stammered. "I did go to Oregon," Clara replied smoothly. "Among other places. I've found the world to be much larger and more interesting than I once believed." Elizabeth stepped closer to her mother, her presence raising obvious questions that made the assembled crowd even more uncomfortable. Here was living proof that Clara had not only survived her exile, but had thrived, creating a family and building a life that seemed to mock the predictions of doom that had followed her departure. The most dramatic moment came when Joshua Blackwood himself appeared, pushing through the crowd with the arrogance that had always characterized his approach to obstacles. At 32, he was still handsome in a weathered way, but the easy charm of his youth had been replaced by the harder edges of a man who had faced more setbacks than successes. Joshua stopped short when he saw Clara, his face cycling through recognition, shock, and something that might have been fear. The confident young man who had once dismissed her so casually was now staring at a woman whose very presence challenged everything he thought he knew about consequences and justice. "Clara Morrison," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "This is ... unexpected." Clara regarded him with the cool assessment of a businesswoman evaluating a potential acquisition. "Hello, Joshua. You're looking well. Marriage and prosperity seem to agree with you." The words carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone listening. Joshua had indeed married and achieved prosperity, but both were now threatened by circumstances he didn't yet understand. "I heard you might be in the area," Joshua continued, trying to regain his composure. "Something about mining interests, I believe." Clara's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh yes, the mining interests. Perhaps we should discuss those. I think you'll find the conversation enlightening." Before Joshua could respond, Rebecca Blackwood arrived on the scene, having heard from servants about the commotion in town. She was now 31, still beautiful but with the brittle elegance of a woman who had lived with disappointment longer than she cared to admit. Rebecca's reaction to seeing Clara was immediate and visceral. She had always known about her husband's dalliance with the blacksmith's daughter, though they had never discussed it directly. Seeing the living proof of that relationship, along with Clara's obvious success, triggered every insecurity Rebecca had harbored for 13 years. "You," Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You're the one. The Morrison girl who caused all that trouble." Clara turned her attention to Rebecca with the same cool assessment she had given Joshua. "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume. How lovely to finally meet the woman who took my place in Joshua's affections. I hope you found the arrangement satisfactory." The public nature of the confrontation was deliberate on Clara's part. She wanted the entire town to witness this moment, to see how far she had risen while their golden couple had struggled with the ordinary challenges of frontier life. "What do you want?" Joshua demanded, his composure finally cracking. "Why have you come back here?" Clara's answer came not in words but in actions. She gestured to Elizabeth, who had been quietly observing the drama with the fascination of someone watching a play unfold. "Elizabeth," Clara said formally, "please retrieve the contracts from our coach. I think it's time that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood understood the true nature of our business relationship." Elizabeth moved with practiced efficiency, returning with a leather portfolio that contained the documents that would change everything. Clara opened it deliberately, savoring the moment before revealing the scope of what she had accomplished. "You see, Joshua," Clara began, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the gathered crowd, "when I learned about the copper deposits in this valley, I realized I had been presented with a unique opportunity, not just to develop a profitable mining operation, but to demonstrate how dramatically my circumstances have changed since we last spoke." She withdrew the contract that Joshua had signed just days earlier, holding it where everyone could see the official seals and signatures. "Morrison Mining Enterprises," Clara continued, "is my company. The generous offer you accepted for your mineral rights came from me. The woman you once considered beneath your notice is now the person who controls the economic future of your ranch." The silence that followed was deafening. Joshua stared at the contract as if it might transform into something else if he looked hard enough. Rebecca's face had gone white with shock and the dawning realization of what this meant for their family's future. "That's impossible," Joshua said weakly. "You were just a girl. You had nothing, knew nothing about business." "I was a girl," Clara agreed. "A girl who learned some very hard lessons about how the world really works. Lessons that served me well when I decided to build something of my own." She gestured to Elizabeth, who stood beside her with the poise of someone accustomed to witnessing her mother's triumphs. "This is my daughter, Elizabeth Morrison. She's 12 years old, fluent in 3 languages, and already understands more about business and finance than most adults in this town. She's also, as you might have guessed, your daughter as well." The revelation hit Joshua like a physical blow. He stared at Elizabeth with new eyes, seeing the resemblance that had been there all along, but that he had been too shocked to notice. The girl he was looking at was his child, raised by the woman he had abandoned to face pregnancy and exile alone. "My daughter?" Joshua whispered. Elizabeth regarded her biological father with the cool assessment she had learned from her mother. She had known this moment would come eventually, but seeing Joshua's reaction, The shock, guilt, and dawning understanding filled her with contempt rather than any desire for connection. "Hello, Father," Elizabeth said, her voice perfectly controlled. "I've heard so much about you." The formality of her greeting was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Here was his child, brilliant and accomplished, who clearly felt nothing but disdain for the man who had contributed to her existence but nothing to her upbringing. Rebecca Blackwood's reaction was swift and predictable. "This is outrageous," she declared, her voice rising with hysteria. "You can't just appear after all these years and make these claims. Where's your proof? Where's your husband?" Clara's response was as calm as Rebecca's was frantic. "I have no husband, Mrs. Blackwood. I never needed one. As for proof?" She gestured to Elizabeth, whose resemblance to Joshua was becoming more obvious by the moment. "I think the evidence speaks for itself." The crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread throughout the town. People who had known Clara as a child now saw her as a successful businesswoman, publicly humiliating the family that had once seemed untouchable. The reversal of fortune was so complete, so dramatic, that it would be talked about for generations. But Clara wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would cement her victory and demonstrate the true scope of her achievement. "You see," Clara continued, addressing not just the Blackwoods, but the entire assembled crowd, "the mineral rights contract you signed, Joshua, is just the beginning. Over the past month, my company has acquired similar rights from ranchers throughout this valley. We now control the copper deposits under approximately 80% of the land in this area." She paused to let the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. "The mining operation we're planning will employ over 1,000 workers. We'll be building a railroad spur to transport ore, establishing several new towns to house employees, and constructing processing facilities that will make this valley one of the most important mining centers in the territory. The transformation she was describing would fundamentally change everything about Willowbrook. The quiet farming and ranching community would become an industrial center with all the wealth and disruption that such development entailed. And I," Clara concluded, "will control all of it. The girl you cast out in shame has returned as the most powerful person in this entire region." Joshua Blackwood stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of what had happened. He had signed away his family's future to the woman he had wronged, creating a situation where his very survival depended on the mercy of someone who had every reason to destroy him. But Clara Morrison was no longer interested in simple revenge. She had built something far more satisfying, a demonstration of how completely she had transcended the limitations that Willowbrook had tried to impose on her. "However," Clara said, her tone becoming businesslike, "I'm not interested in destroying this community. I'm interested in transforming it. The mining operation will bring prosperity to everyone who's willing to adapt to the new realities." She turned to address the crowd directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Morrison Mining Enterprises will be hiring local workers, purchasing supplies from local businesses, and working with community leaders to ensure that development benefits everyone. The past is the past. What matters now is the future we build together." It was a masterful display of magnanimity that made her victory even more complete. Rather than seeking petty revenge, Clara was offering prosperity to the very people who had once rejected her. She would be remembered not as someone who returned to settle scores, but as someone who had risen above her circumstances to become a force for positive change. Elizabeth watched her mother's performance with admiration and pride. This was the woman who had raised her, taught her, and shown her what was possible when intelligence was combined with determination and strategic thinking. As the crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly about the changes that were coming to their valley, Clara Morrison stood in the center of Willowbrook's main street, as the undisputed architect of its future. The frightened pregnant girl who had left 13 years earlier was truly gone, replaced by a woman who had not only survived her exile but had used it to build something remarkable. Clara Morrison had returned to Willowbrook, and nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation was complete, the reckoning achieved, and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities that the people of Willowbrook were only beginning to understand. 5 years after Clara Morrison's dramatic return to Willowbrook, the valley bore little resemblance to the quiet ranching community it had once been. The copper mines had transformed the landscape into a bustling industrial center, with 3 new towns sprouting around the major extraction sites. The railroad spur that Clara had promised now carried ore-laden trains eastward twice daily, their whistles echoing off the mountain walls that had once known only the lowing of cattle. Standing on the observation deck of the Morrison Mining Company headquarters, a 3-story brick building that dominated Willowbrook's expanded Main Street, Clara watched the evening shift change at the largest mine. Hundreds of workers emerged from the depths, their faces blackened with copper dust, but their pockets heavy with wages that had made them the envy of laborers throughout the territory. Elizabeth, now 17 and poised to begin her studies at Stanford University, joined her mother at the window. The young woman bore little resemblance to the quiet 12-year-old who had witnessed Clara's triumph. She had grown into a striking beauty with her mother's intelligence and a steel-hard determination that impressed even the most seasoned business associates. The Peterson mine exceeded production targets again this month, Elizabeth reported, reviewing the ledger in her hands. We're ahead of schedule on the Denver contracts, and the new processing facility should be operational by spring. Clara nodded with satisfaction. Morrison Mining Enterprises had become the largest copper producer in the Rocky Mountain region, employing over 2,000 workers and generating revenue that placed Clara among the wealthiest individuals in the American West. But more satisfying than the money was the knowledge that she had built something lasting, something that would provide opportunities for generations to come. The transformation of Willowbrook had been more dramatic than even Clara had envisioned. The sleepy frontier town now boasted electric lighting, a telephone exchange, 3 hotels, and a hospital that served the entire valley. The population had grown from fewer than 300 to over 5,000, with people arriving weekly to work in the mines or establish businesses that served the growing community. Joshua Blackwood had adapted to the new reality with the pragmatism of a man who understood that his choices were limited. His ranch now supplied beef to the mining camps, a contract that Clara had arranged through intermediaries to avoid awkward direct negotiations. The Blackwood family had prospered under the new economic order, though they would never again enjoy the unchallenged social prominence they had once taken for granted. The most dramatic change had come in Joshua himself. The arrogant young man who had once dismissed Clara so callously had been replaced by someone more thoughtful, more aware of consequences. He had made several attempts to approach Elizabeth over the years, seeking some kind of relationship with the daughter he had never known existed. Elizabeth's response had been consistently polite but distant. She felt no animosity toward Joshua, but neither did she feel any particular need for his presence in her life. Clara had been both mother and father to her, providing everything she needed to develop into a confident, capable young woman. "He's asked again about attending my graduation ceremony," Elizabeth mentioned casually, still studying the production reports. "I told him he could come if he wanted to, but that I wouldn't be setting aside any special time for him." Clara smiled at her daughter's matter-of-fact tone. Elizabeth had inherited her mother's ability to assess situations without emotional interference, a trait that would serve her well in the business world she was preparing to enter. "That seems appropriate," Clara agreed. "Your relationship with him is yours to define." The approaching graduation represented a bittersweet milestone for Clara. Elizabeth would be leaving for California in the fall, beginning her formal education at one of the few universities that accepted women into their business programs. Clara was proud beyond measure, but she would miss having her closest advisor and confidant by her side. More importantly, Elizabeth's departure marked the beginning of a new phase in Clara's own life. At 32, she had achieved everything she had once thought impossible. Her business empire was secure, her daughter was launched on her own path to success, and the people who had once rejected her now depended on her for their prosperity. Question that increasingly occupied Clara's thoughts was what to do with this second half of her life. She had proven everything she had set out to prove, settled every score that had mattered, and built a legacy that would outlast her own lifetime. But she was still young, still energetic, and still driven by the same curiosity and ambition that had carried her from exile to triumph. The answer came in the form of a letter from Governor Richardson of Montana, who had been following Clara's business success with growing interest. Richardson was now planning a run for the United States Senate, and he needed the support of influential business leaders throughout the territory. His letter was an invitation to join his campaign as a financial advisor and strategic consultant. But, more intriguingly, Richardson's letter hinted at possibilities that went beyond simple campaign support. Montana was moving toward statehood, and there would be opportunities for people with Clara's combination of business acumen and regional influence to shape the new state's development policies. "Are you considering it?" Elizabeth asked, having read the letter over her mother's shoulder. Clara folded the document thoughtfully. Politics represented a new arena, one where her gender would create different challenges than those she had faced in business. But it also offered the chance to influence policy on a scale that could benefit thousands of people throughout the region. "I think I am," Clara admitted. "Your departure for university might be the perfect time for me to explore new possibilities." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Clara's secretary announced that Nathan Prescott, her chief engineer, had urgent news about a potential new copper discovery in the northern part of the territory. As Clara listened to Prescott's report about promising geological surveys, she felt the familiar excitement that came with new opportunities. The Morrison mining empire could expand again, creating more jobs and bringing development to areas that desperately needed economic investment. But as she considered the implications of another major expansion, Clara realized that her motivations had evolved significantly since her return to Willowbrook. She was no longer driven primarily by the need to prove herself or settle old scores. Instead, she found herself genuinely interested in using her success to create opportunities for others. The girl who had been cast out of Willowbrook in shame had not only survived and thrived, she had become someone who could lift entire communities out of poverty and isolation. It was a responsibility that Clara now embraced with the same determination she had once applied to her own survival. "Schedule a survey expedition for next month," Clara told Prescott. "If the deposits are as promising as you suggest, we'll begin development immediately." As evening fell over the transformed valley, Clara Morrison stood in her headquarters and contemplated a future that seemed full of unlimited possibilities. Elizabeth would soon be gone, beginning her own journey toward whatever remarkable achievements awaited her. Clara herself stood poised to enter the political arena, where she could influence policy on a territorial and eventually state level. The transformation that had begun with a pregnant 13-year-old's exile from a small frontier town had become something far larger than personal vindication. Clara Morrison had become a force for positive change, someone whose success created opportunities for thousands of others. Looking out over the lights of New Willowbrook as the expanded town had been renamed, Clara reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that true power came not from destroying one's enemies, but from building something so significant that past grievances became irrelevant. The frightened girl who had left Willowbrook in tears was truly gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to transform every obstacle into opportunity, every setback into motivation for greater achievement. Clara Morrison had not merely survived her exile. She had used it to become someone extraordinary, and her story was far from over. The second act of her remarkable life was about to begin, with possibilities that stretched as far as her ambition could reach. The girl who had once been banished from a small frontier town was now ready to help shape the future of an entire state. The transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.